The Sangam, Panther by Kenneth Anderson. News filtered through to my home in Bangalore that a leopard, or panther, as it is more commonly known in India, was killing people in the vicinity of a place called Sangam, a little over 70 miles south of the city. Man-eating panthers are rare in southern India. To begin with, the jungles are not so extensive or nearly so continuously mountainous as in the north, particularly along the foothills of the vast Himalayan range. The exception is the Western Ghats, which are almost wholly covered with forest for over 400 miles, with an average breadth of 10 to 15 miles. But the other forest areas are of much smaller extent and are more or less surrounded by cultivation. This causes carnivores, and particularly panthers, to confine their attentions to the herds of cattle and goats, in which the country is abundantly rich, and to a lesser extent to the village curs, locally known as pie dogs, which are, like the common monkey, the curse of the land. Prior to the advent of hydrophobia vaccine, large numbers of persons died yearly of infection from the bite of mad dogs, as these curs constantly contract rabies, especially in the hot weather. Monkeys are and always have been a major menace, doing untold damage to crops and fruit trees. The monkey has a strong religious significance to Indians, and great objection is raised against any attempt to harm it. Panthers, at least so far as the pie dogs and monkeys are concerned, therefore perform a great service to the land. In the Western Ghats, of which I have just spoken of, the rainfall is very heavy, even exceeding 100 inches per year. They are covered with dense bamboo, long grass, and thick evergreen vegetation, the breeding grounds of clouds of mosquitoes, ticks, leeches, flies, and other animal pests. Panthers do not like much water, and they detest the pests in any and all their many forms. So in the only region where they could multiply unmolested, they are hardly to be found. By a natural arrangement, therefore, panthers, which are found in all the other jungles of southern India, generally have plenty to eat and somehow do not become addicted to the bad habit of man-eating. A notable exception to this was the panther of Gumalapur, a story I have related elsewhere. In that case, there were special circumstances that caused it to take to man-eating. In Bangalore, news often reached us of people being mauled by panthers and tigers, more often by the former. But nobody took particular notice of these rumors, as on-the-spot investigations always told the same tale. Some villager, with his matchlock, or some inexperienced hunter would let fly at a panther, generally with slugs, and succeed only in hurting it. Then, inexperienced in jungle lore, he would attempt to follow it up through lantana bushes or amongst rocks and get mauled, sometimes severely, for his pains. In years gone by, over 75% of such cases of mauling resulted in death from septicemia. But with the advent of the SELVA drugs, casualties dropped to below 10%. So nobody took much notice when such news came in. Why should they? They had other work to do. Moreover, rumor is invariably much exaggerated in India. A slight scratch is magnified into a severe mauling, and a mauling turns into a killing. When an actual killing does occur, it is widely described in the press as several killings. Therefore, when I heard that a panther had killed a woman and later killed and eaten a child at Sangam, I did not believe it. And then the panther killed a third and a fourth time. The press got hold of the news and it was splashed across the front pages. Several hunters from Bangalore, Mysore, and Madras went after the animal, but for a month the panther did not kill. One of the hunters succeeded in shooting a panther, and this fact, coupled with the cessation of human kills, seemed to indicate that it was the man-eater that had been shot. So the hunters returned to the towns. Then the panther killed once more, but was prevented from eating its victim, a man who was sleeping in a shed-like room with a pack of 4 mongrel dogs, with which he used to hunt hare and sometimes deer. A thorn fence protected the entrance to the shed. The roof comprised loose bits of zinc sheeting, and the wall consisted of wooden stakes driven into the ground in close formation, the gaps being stuffed with thorns. The panther came at night, and with its paws contrived to open a passage between the end stake of the doorway and the thorn fence across the entrance. The dogs panicked, barking and howling loudly and cowering to one side. But the man must have just woken. The panther entered the shed. The dogs clustered together but did nothing, and the marauder, walking past them, grabbed the man by the throat. He died after uttering a single piercing wail. The people in the neighboring hut had been disturbed by the noise made by the dogs barking and growling in the shed. They wondered what was happening, but nobody would go outside to investigate. The panther then tried to drag the dead man out of the shed through the same gap by which it had entered. The gap was not big enough, so the panther itself passed through and tried to drag the man after it. But the body became entangled in the thorns and stuck fast. The panther then gave a mighty heave, which succeeded in unbalancing the fence, which fell with a crash on top of the animal. This must have frightened him considerably, for he made off, leaving the corpse still entangled amongst the thorns. The continued noise resulting from the efforts of the panther now alarmed the people in the next hut, who had been listening breathlessly all this time. They began to shout and woke other villagers. After quite a while, some of the braver men came forth carrying lanterns, armed with matchlocks, bludgeons, and staves, to find the dead man, but no panther. The alarm now spread afresh, and news was brought to me by the village patel, or headman, who came to Bangalore expressly for the purpose. I was at that time able to take 2 days of casual leave, while Sunday made a third, so I agreed to go with him and attempt to shoot the panther within those 3 days. The road to Sangam ran past the town of Kankanhalli, 36 miles from Bangalore, from where it began to descend sharply to the bed of the Kaveri River. The last 10 miles of the track was really atrocious, and my Studebaker rocked and creaked and groaned in all its joints in protest at such bad treatment. Hairpin bends at ridiculous gradients and sharp angles, where all milestones and furlong slabs were colored black to prevent them from being uprooted by wild elephants, who have a great aversion to anything white, betokened my approach to journey's end, and soon I reached the little traveller's bungalow after a short but exceedingly tough journey. The word Sangam denotes a joining or confluence, and was most appropriate, for it marked the junction of the Kaveri River with its tributary, the Akravarti, which flows in almost a straight line southwards from its source north of Bangalore. The Kaveri here flows from west to east, Sangam being on its northern bank within Mysore state territory. The southern bank of the Kaveri comes within the jungles of North Coimbatore district. Some 13 miles east of Sangam, Mysore state territory ends and is flanked by the Salem district, which thereafter holds the northern bank of the river, with North Coimbatore district continuing along the southern bank. Both North Coimbatore and Salem districts belong to the Madras Presidency. Sangam is a beautifully wooded spot, offering in normal times first-rate mahseer fishing, with crocodile shooting among the sandbanks and rocks in any direction along the river. On the Mysore side of the forest, there are spotted deer, sambar, barking deer, wild pig, feathered game, and an occasional bear, panther, or even a tiger. Elephants often cross over from the Coimbatore bank. Along the southern bank, in the Coimbatore jungles, all the above abound in greater numbers, in addition to several fine herds of bison. Elephant and bear are particularly numerous. After parking the car under the huge muthi trees that flanked the river and grew beside the bungalow, I walked across to the small village where the dog keeper had recently been killed, and inspected the scene for myself. in addition to being given graphic accounts of what had happened by the neighbors who had heard so much that day, but had done nothing to help the poor fellow. The Patel who had returned with me joined in the voluble tale. With much questioning and cross-questioning, it became apparent that this panther was going to be an exceedingly difficult animal to bag, as on the north bank of the river it had a very wide expanse of jungle to wander over, without taking into consideration the many square miles of forest on the southern or Coimbatore side. But the latter could reasonably be excluded, since panthers, unlike tigers, generally dislike swimming across big rivers, although they swim well when compelled to do so. The first, and apparently the only thing to do, was to tie out baits. With the Patel's active help, I purchased 5 large bull calves. The first of these we tethered about half a mile west of the bungalow, and about the same distance from the river bank. The second on a line roughly parallel with the river and a mile farther west. The third a mile farther west than the second, and the fourth on the farther bank of the Akravarti tributary, about half a mile east of the bungalow and the same distance from the Kaveri, and the fifth a mile east of the fourth bait. Thus the 5 baits were roughly in a straight line flanking the river, about half a mile inland and with a distance of 4 miles between the farthest bait to the west and the farthest bait to the east. It was sunset before I returned to the bungalow. A cold dinner appeased my appetite, eaten on the small bungalow veranda and washed down with 2 steaming mugs of tea. After lighting my pipe, I sat with my back to the wall, listening to the subdued rush of the river as it sped along its rocky bed. It was a dark night, and fairly cloudy. Such stars as could be seen peeping occasionally between clouds would be insufficient for night watching, so I went inside and fell asleep. Early next morning we checked the baits. They were all alive. I walked up the road down which I had come the previous day, climbing up the hairpin bends and cart section. There were no panther tracks to be seen. A herd of spotted deer and 3 sambar, singly and at different places, had crossed the road during the night, but no other animals had passed. When returning to the bungalow, instead of coming back along the road, I cut down the hill through the jungle and came onto the dry bed of the Akravarti, where I turned southwards and walked in the sand, looking for possible pug marks. There were none to be seen, but the same herd of spotted deer that had crossed the road had also traversed the sands. In due course, I passed my bait number 4 and came to where the Akravarti joined the Kaveri. A day and a half, out of the 3 at my disposal, had now passed, and I had not even seen the panther's pug marks. The situation seemed hopeless. After lunch, I decided to walk in an easterly direction downstream along the Kaveri for about 3.5 miles to a gorge where the river narrowed to about 20 feet. At this spot, it roared through a chasm known as Meek Dat. The meaning of that word in the Kanarese language is the goat's leap. Legend records that years and years ago, a jungle sheep pursued by wild dogs on the Coimbatore side and driven to the brink of the river performed the prodigious feat of leaping those 20 feet to safety on the Mysore side. Here, all other sounds are drowned by the roar of the turbulent waters, hurling themselves through the narrow opening, and a man can hardly hear himself even when he shouts his very loudest. I sat on the edge of the rocks and watched the troubled, racing river. 100 yards away, downstream, where the surface had become placid again, an occasional fish broke water, leaping into the air as if evincing sheer exuberance and the joy of living. A fish-eagle circled in the ethereal blue of a clear sky. After a while, I rose and retraced my steps to the bungalow. I had still not found any panther tracks. The night was clear. Although there was no moon, there were none of the previous night's clouds, and the starlight was enough in the jungle to enable one to see for a few yards. The watchman in charge of the bungalow owned a pie dog. the name by which mongrels in India are known, and against my custom, and only because time was so short, I asked him to lend it to me till midnight. He hummed and hawed at first, but when 3 rupees had changed hands, he agreed. While walking along the road that day, I had noticed a rock at its ledge hardly a mile away. I took the dog, tied it at the foot of the rock, and walked away down the road. When out of sight of the dog, I turned to my right and cut into the jungle, coming back to the rock on its off side. Silently, I clambered up and lay flat on its top. The rock was still warm from the sun that had been shining on it all day. Thinking it had been abandoned, the dog began barking, whining, and howling by turns. Dogs are too intelligent, and it is unfair to tie them out as baits. Unlike cattle and goats, they sense danger at once, and even if not attacked, go through hours of mental agony. I have known a dog which was tied out as bait for a panther, although it was not harmed, become so nervous that it fell sick the following day and died within a week. I watched from the top of the rock. Nearly an hour passed, and then a shadowy, grey shape came scampering down the road. It moved fast till about 10 feet from the dog, and then it stopped. Could it be the panther? The stars shed just enough light to prevent the darkness from being total, but no more than that. I could just see the grey shape looking at the dog. The dog growled furiously as it turned round to face the intruder. It must be a panther, I thought, as I aligned my rifle in its direction, preparatory to depressing the switch of my torch, which was fastened along the barrel. Said the intruder, followed by a disparaging but loud. It was a hyena, the common striped hyena of southern India. The dog growled still more ferociously, and then began to bark frenziedly. Now began an amusing drama, such as watchers by the night are sometimes privileged to witness in a jungle. The hyena darted off the road and into the undergrowth, where he began to say, ending with his usual disparaging. The dog faced the noise and barked loudly. The hyena reappeared on the road, beyond the dog, but watching him, and cackled. Unlike his African cousins, the spotted and the brown hyena, the former being the familiar laughing hyena we have all heard about, the Indian hyena is generally a silent animal, hunting alone or at the most in pairs. Spotted hyenas move in packs. As a rule, all hyenas are cowardly animals, although they are extremely strong for their size and have enormously powerful jaws, which can easily bite right through a man's arm, bone and all. Quite rarely they display extraordinary courage, of which I once saw an example. I had been sitting over a panther kill. The owner turned up and began to eat. I had held my shot, as I wanted, if possible, to learn the sex of the animal before killing it. This was because I had been told a male and a female panther lived in the vicinity, and that the female was accompanied by 2 cubs about 6 months old. I wanted to make certain I did not shoot the mother. While I hesitated, a hyena had arrived on the scene, and his arrival on that occasion had been dramatic. He came as if from nowhere, and the first I knew of his arrival was when he had scampered boldly up to the panther, voicing the same medley of sounds I have just described. The panther, sprawled across its kill, had glared at the newcomer with blazing orbs, snarling and growling furiously. The hyena had approached to within 5 feet, just beyond the reach of the panther's paw sweep, and had set up such a cacophony of hideous sounds as to resemble a chorus of the demons of hell. The panther had added to the noise by growling still louder, and every now and then striking at the hyena with its claws. The latter just rocked backwards out of reach of each blow, after which it would faint with a short rush forward while gradually working around to the rear of the panther. At first, the panther had turned around correspondingly to keep the hyena in view, growling even more loudly while making short jabs and slaps with its paws in the direction of the hyena. But the hyena, always out of reach, had hawed and sneered, gargled and gurgled with unabated zeal. Frightened, or perhaps just disgusted at the unseemly racket, the panther had finally risen from its kill, and then walked slowly away with many a backward glance amidst snarls at the hyena, who continued his weird din till the panther had vanished in the undergrowth. Then he had fallen upon the kill himself with the greatest and, no doubt, thoroughly deserved enthusiasm. But the hyena, which I continued to watch from the rock, was undoubtedly a little scared of the mongrel dog. Frequently he would disappear to one on other side of the road. Then would come a pitter-patter amongst the dried leaves as he doubled back and forth, this way and that, to reappear at all places while continuing to make his unseemly, weird, and often comical sounds. The lesson I learned from these two experiences was that hyenas try to frighten their opponents with their continuous unseemly cackle. The first hyena had frightened the panther off its own kill, while this one was trying to frighten the dog, perhaps just to clear it off the road or into the undergrowth, where he could pounce upon it more easily. But the dog was tied up and so could not move away, which the hyena could not understand. An hour of this sort of thing ceased to be amusing to me, and I realized the racket, especially the part played by the hyena, was almost certain to drive away any panther in the vicinity, man-eater or otherwise. So, groping for a small piece of rock, I hurled it at the hyena. My aim fell short of its mark, and the stone thudded on the hard surface of the road. The hyena jumped nervously and scampered into the bushes, while the dog stopped barking and began to whimper. I thought I had rid the scene of a most unwelcome visitor. Perhaps a quarter of an hour had passed when I heard the furtive pitter-patter again, shortly followed by the hyena's queer notes. The dog barked and growled. I threw another stone at the hyena. He stopped, only to start again after 10 minutes. Once more a stone, once more silence, followed by a new beginning. Only after about the 5th stone did the hyena feel that the spot had somehow become unhealthy, and with the final took himself off. It was past 10 o'clock. My watch showed 5 minutes to midnight when I heard the approach of human voices. A little later, I saw the twinkling lights of 2 lanterns, illuminating from that distance the walking feet of many men. The dog saw them and stopped its moaning. When the party drew level with the dog, I counted 11 men, 2 of whom were carrying lanterns, and all of whom, except one, carried staves and lathis, or long bamboo sticks of some sort or another. The one exception was armed with a matchlock. They had obviously come in search of me. I answered their call and came down from the rock. The men then told me that scarcely an hour earlier, the panther had made its way into one of the huts of the very village where the dog-keeper had been attacked by burrowing through the thatched wall, and had seized one of the 5 sleeping inmates, a woman about 25 years old. She had shrieked aloud as she found herself being dragged away, waking the other 4 persons in the room, who were her father, 2 brothers, and mother. Meanwhile, the panther was trying to drag her out through the opening in the thatch by which it had entered. The girl struggled violently. The panther dropped her and bit her viciously. One of the brothers struck a match to lighten the darkness of the hut's interior. Her father, with commendable bravery and presence of mind, hurled the only missile which came to his hand at the panther. The missile happened to be a brass water pot of some weight, and it struck the panther full on its side. Man-eaters whether tigers or panthers, invariably have a streak of cowardice in their natures, and this panther was no exception to the general rule. Leaving its victim, it had dashed out of the hut through the opening in the thatch. The screams of the mauled woman and the general pandemonium had awakened the whole village. The menfolk came out with lanterns, armed as best as they could. The party of 11 had then come to the rest house to find me, and the watchman from whom I had borrowed the dog had directed them to where I was sitting. Telling one of the men to untie the rope and bring the dog in tow, we hastened back to the bungalow, and I brought out my first aid kit from the backseat of the Studebaker. We then hurried on to the village, where an appalling sight awaited me. The poor girl had been bitten right through her right shoulder and again in the abdomen, where the panther had seized her the second time when she had struggled to escape. One breast and her chest right down to the side were in ribbons, where the foul claws had buried themselves deep in her flesh, raking it open with their downward sweep. Her jacket and sari were torn to pieces, and she lay in a welter of blood, blissfully unconscious after her experience. I saw at once that such meager first aid equipment as I had was totally inadequate to meet the situation, but we quickly washed the wounds with a strong solution of potassium permanganate and roughly bandaged her chest and abdomen with strips torn from another sari. Her father, 2 brothers, and 3 willing men from the village then carried her onto a rope cot to the Studebaker. Placing her as comfortably as possible in the dicky, I took her 3 male relations aboard, and we set out for the town of Kankanhali, which boasted the nearest village hospital. We reached there after 3:30 in the morning, when I awoke the doctor and handed over the injured woman. Her condition appeared to be very low, owing to the great deal of blood she had lost. By 4:30, I was in the bathroom of the traveller's bungalow at Kankanhali, where I removed my blood-soaked clothing and took a cold bath. I had no change of clothing with me, having left them behind at Sangam in the confusion of the moment, so I borrowed a clean dhoti or a loincloth and a blanket from the bungalow waiter. Dawn was breaking when I knocked at the post office, awoke a most obliging postmaster from his sleep, paid the necessary late fee, and dispatched an urgent telegram to Bangalore requesting extension of leave for 4 more days. When I returned to the bungalow, I found the younger brother of the injured woman awaiting me in tears. He had come from the hospital to tell me his sister had just died. Shortly afterwards, the father came to ask me to take his daughter's body back in the car to Sangam for cremation by the banks of the river Kaveri, in which the ashes would eventually be scattered. It was a request I could not refuse. The bungalow servant told me he wanted his dhoti and blanket back, so I had to dress again in my blood-smeared clothes. We drove back to the hospital, placed the still limp body of the girl in the back seat, and set out on the return journey to Sangam, delayed by 2 hours at the police station, where we reported the occurrence. After a bath in a quiet pool beside the river, free from crocodiles, a change into fresh clothing, a cold lunch, and 2 big mugs of tea, I lay back in a rickety old armchair to review the situation. My loaded pipe, from which the comforting smoke arose in spirals, to the roughly tiled low roof, helped a great deal to soothe my ragged nerves after the events of the previous night and to prevent my eyes from closing with sleep. What should I do with the remaining 4 days and 5 nights at my disposal, to rid these poor village folk from another and still another, and God only knew how many more repetitions of these terrible events? Facts appeared to indicate that 1. The panther would not take animal baits. 2. It had a wide range of cover. And 3. It was predisposed to dragging people out of huts. Then, while I pondered, I fell asleep. At 3 p.m. I awoke, and a possible line of action appeared to have presented itself while I slept. It was this. The small village of Sangam, with about a dozen huts, had been constructed in the usual fashion, on both sides of a central lane. I remembered that on the southern side of this lane, and not far from the river bank, a small herd of cattle belonging to the villagers were corralled in a small enclosure surrounded by a fence of bamboo, interspersed with cut lantana brambles. The only dogs left in the village, which had belonged to the man who had been killed, were enclosed in the shed-like room where he had been slain, which happened to adjoin the larger cattle enclosure on its western side. The idea came to me that if I posted myself at night in the midst of the cattle, not only would I be perfectly safe from unexpected attack, as the cattle would grow restive and give ample warning should the panther approach, but this very restlessness and the fact that the dogs too would join in the alarm would help me to learn of the panther's presence should he enter the village. Meanwhile, I would keep my 5 live baits tied out on the off chance that one of them might be taken instead. With this plan in view, I dressed warmly for the night, wearing a khaki woolen balaclava cap to keep off the dew. My usual night equipment included, this time, a large flask of tea, some biscuits, and my pipe, as I knew that smoking in this case would do no harm. Because of the panther's presence, the villagers were inside their huts, behind doors barricaded and reinforced with freshly cut thorns long before 6 o'clock. I took up my position in the middle of the cattle enclosure. About me was a space of about 50 yards in every direction, with nearly 100 nondescript cattle scattered around. At first, the animals resented my presence and crowded to the corners away from me, leaving me isolated in the center of the pen. I started out trying to make friends with them. One kicked over my flask of tea and nearly broke it. Moreover, some of the bulls were rather truculent and made short jabs at me with their horns if I came too close. After an hour in each other's company, the situation eased a little, and I was able to make my way guardedly to the center of the herd, about half of whom were now resting on the ground. I got down also. As the hours dragged by, the silence was unbroken, except for an occasional snort from one of the animals, or the trampling of another as it altered its position. One cow became friendly and insisted in nuzzling her muzzle against my chest as a gesture of companionship. Eventually, she flopped down contentedly on the ground beside me. Then cattle ticks began to bite me, in many places and mercilessly. I scratched myself vigorously, although I knew that by doing so I would only increase the irritation. It grew colder, and soon I was glad to nuzzle myself, in my turn, up against the warm body of the cow who had chosen to open this strange friendship with me. Now and again, one of the herd would moo contentedly, or snort, or kick, or flop down to the ground, or struggle to its feet. The hours still dragged by, and the ticks continued to bite. At 1 o'clock, a sambar belled on the small hill to the north of the village. It was a doe that had called, and she called again and again. Then her call was taken up by a kakar, whose hoarse bark resounded across the nalas which furrowed the lower slopes of the hillock. The sambar doe had stopped belling by this time, while the kakar climbed up, giving occasional vent to his guttural call. Whatever it was that had alarmed them had come down the hill. Some 20 minutes later, spotted deer began their warning cries, answering one another from the jungle that slopes from the base of the hill to the edge of the river. Either a tiger or a panther was afoot, and the next few minutes would tell whether the carnivore was just a normal animal or the marauder I was awaiting. It was almost pitch dark when the cattle grew restless. With one accord, those lying on the ground scrambled to their feet, and I did the same, keeping close beside the friendly cow. Some of the bulls snorted, and the herd were all turned towards the lane that divided the small village and passed by the thorn hedge that bordered the cattle stockade. The animals became very restless and began to gather in a mass at the further end of the stockade away from the hedge and lane. The 4 dogs in the neighboring shed had been barking furiously. They now began to whimper. Whatever had frightened them was passing down that lane at that very moment. I had got myself wedged in the midst of the cattle, and had to watch carefully against being impaled on one of the many horns that were nervously tossing about me. I began to force myself through the herd to reach their front rank, hoping that I might be able to see something, but the darkness and the hedge revealed nothing. I could hear the dogs howling and whimpering in the shed in which they were locked. My ears were attuned to catch the slightest sound, but the noise made by the cattle and the dogs gave me little chance. Some minutes later, I caught the faintest of scratching noises. Listening carefully, I located it as coming from further down the lane. They became louder and more impatient. Then I realized that the panther was scratching at a door of one of the huts some distance away. Breaking through the remainder of the cattle, I approached the fence on tiptoe, hoping to be able to peep over it and catch a glimpse of the panther when I switched on the torch at the end of my rifle. The inmates of the hut at which the panther was scratching chose that very moment to set up a bedlam of shrieks and shouts. The silence was broken by the most frightful din. Thinking that the man-eater had succeeded in forcing his way into the hut, I threw discretion to the winds and rushed for the bamboo and thorn door that formed the entrance of the stockade. At dusk, I had firmly wedged a huge Y-shaped log into place, and it took some precious moments to release its base from the big stones against which I had jammed it. Dragging it aside and switching on the torch, I heaved the clumsy door back and stepped into the lane. Nothing was to be seen in any direction. Keeping my back to the thorn fence to guard against an attack from the rear, I shone the beam in all directions, but I still saw nothing. The panther had disappeared into thin air. Meanwhile, the shrieks and shouts continued unabated. And then it occurred to me that perhaps the panther was inside the hut all this time, mauling and killing the inmates, and with this alarming thought in mind, I began carefully to cover the intervening 20 yards. When I came abreast of the entrance, I found it was shut fast. I called out to the inmates. At first, due to the noise they were making, they could not hear me. Then I called again, louder and many times. Then the hubbub gradually subsided. I shouted to the occupants to open the door. They would not do so. Then a tremulous voice from inside asked whether I was a man or devil. I called back that it was I, and that the panther had gone. The voice replied that the inmates would open the door only when morning came. Meanwhile, my torch beam clearly showed the fresh claw marks on the door of the hut, where the panther had just tried to effect an entrance. I returned to the stockade, reclosed the door, replaced the Y-shaped log and the stones, and went back to the spot where I had been lying against the cow when the alarm had begun. To my horror, I found that the milling feet of the herd had smashed my thermos, and it was now impossible to drink the hot tea for which I longed. My biscuits also had been devoured, and as I watched her ruefully, the friendly cow devoured the last of the paper in which they had been wrapped. Fortunately, I had kept my pipe and tobacco in my pocket, and with this, I spent the rest of the night in comparative comfort, once again nestling against the side of the cow. I returned to the bungalow at dawn, tired and disappointed. Worst of all, my body was a mass of tick bites and itched abominably. Further, I knew only too well that each bite would fester during the coming 10 days, and that I was in for a most uncomfortable time. A cold bath and change, followed by hot tea, tinned bacon and bread and butter, helped to ease my gloom, and by 7:30 a.m. I was asleep. I awoke for lunch at midday and slept again till 3 p.m. Then I got up and began to work out another plan. It would be impossible to sit with the cattle again, for if I was to get bitten once more by as many ticks as in the previous night, I might end with a dose of tick fever. And yet, it was undeniable that both the cattle and the dogs had helped admirably in giving me the alarm when the panther had passed down the lane. At last, I had a fresh idea. that appeared to be the only compromise in the situation. The roof of the dog shed consisted of scraps of zinc sheeting. I decided that I would lie on that roof, suitably camouflaged and overlooking the lane, so that I should be able to shoot the panther if it walked down the lane again. The cattle and the dogs would still help me by giving the alarm. I could protect my rear and both flanks by heaping stacks of cut thorns onto the roof. Any heavy body, like the panther, that leapt upon the zinc roof would necessarily give its presence away by the noise that would follow. Not only did this appear to be the only solution, but actually a good solution of the problem. So I hurried towards the village, carrying my night kit, biscuits and tea, poured into an empty beer bottle borrowed from the bungalow watchman. After telling the villagers of my new plan, willing hands soon stacked piles of cut thorn branches onto the zinc roof of the goat shed in the form of a square. Others brought dried straw, which they placed on the roof within the square of thorns for me to lie on. At 6 p.m., I took up my position. There were two disadvantages that almost immediately began to show themselves. The first, that having to face the lane all the time, I would have to lie so that my legs would be slightly higher than my head, for the zinc roof sloped slightly downwards from back to front to allow rainwater to flow off easily. The second, that I would have to remain lying on my stomach for most of the night, since my slightest movement sounded distinctly on the zinc roof. But the advantages were that I was safe from a surprise attack from the rear, and that I had a clear and unobstructed view of the lane and could hear distinctly, particularly if the cattle or the dogs became uneasy. And lastly, that I was away from those awful ticks. But that night was a peaceful one, without any indication whatever that the panther had come within 2 or 3 miles of the village. Back at the bungalow next morning, I had another bath and another day-long sleep. Each day, I had had my 5 live baits checked by a group of men, but none of these beasts had been harmed. That night, I took up position on the roof once more. It was past 2 a.m., and there had been no alarms from the surrounding jungle, and I felt very drowsy. Suddenly, as in a dream, I heard the cattle begin to stir restlessly. One of the dogs in the shed beneath me growled. Then all 4 of them began to bark or howl together. Peering forward slowly, I began to scan the village lane in both directions. Starlight was not good at that moment, only enough to prevent the night from being obscure. The lane to right and left appeared as a faint blur and of a slightly lighter shade than the surroundings. I could hear nothing and see nothing. Then I caught the faintest of sounds. It appeared to be a hiss, such as a cobra might make. Yes, there it was again, and it came from in front and directly below me. Was it a hiss of a snake or the faint noise a panther makes when he curls back the skin of his upper lip? I peered downwards and at first could see nothing. Seconds later, a faint elongated shape registered itself in my vision in that difficult light. A smudge of an infinitesimally lighter shade than the surrounding blur of the lane. I stared at it and thought I saw it move. The hiss was repeated more distinctly this time. It appeared to come from this lighter smudge. The dogs inside the shed below me now started to whine and whimper, and the cattle were very restless. I realized that I could not point my rifle downwards from where I lay. I would have to move forward another foot perhaps, till my head and shoulders completely cleared the edge of the zinc sheet on which I was lying. I began to do this, but despite my utmost care, the straw rustled and the zinc creaked faintly. There came an ominous growl from that lightish smudge, and I knew that I was discovered, and that within the next few seconds the panther would probably jump onto the zinc roof and onto me. Kicking myself forward the remaining 6 inches, I lowered the rifle over the side of the roof and depressed the torch switch. 2 gleaming orbs reflected the light from a spotted body, crouched for the spring. Only a single shot was required at that point-blank range, and the spark of life slowly faded from those blazing orbs. From fiery white, they became a dull orange, then a faint green, then an empty glimmer, and finally a purplish blue as the light was reflected back by the now lifeless retina. It was an old female that I saw next morning, with canine teeth worn down almost to their stubs. Her coat was extremely pale. Even the rosettes were ill-formed and dull. Her claws were blunt and worn. There appeared to be no other signs of deformity of any sort about her, or indication of an earlier wound. It seemed that only old age and the prospect of gradual starvation through her physical incapacity to kill animals had caused the Sangam Panther to make war on the human race. A war which, however ghastly and fearsome while it lasts, invariably ends in the death of the feline. Modern firearms and the human intellect are heavy odds against jungle instinct, cunning, and the pangs of hunger. The end.